All right, today in Chapter 10, we will talk about the economic growth, financial system, and business cycles. And we will talk about long run economic growth and um, what contributes to it, saving investment in the financial system, and how that also contributes to long run economic growth and the business cycle. So, a strong economy is desirable for all countries. Usually, when we have higher rates, higher GDP, then we have higher GDP per capita, and this is associated with better outcomes across the board, better literacy rates, better life expectancy, better health outcomes, etc. And so we'll explore a bit about what it means to be a strong economy versus a weak economy and the things that lead to these things, to a strong and weak economy. And when we talk about long run economic growth, and we talk about how rising productivity increases the average standard of living. So over time, we have become a more productive nation thanks to the acquisition of, education, skills, technology, for example, has made us a lot more efficient. And despite the fact that we do have downturns, we do have recessions, the overall long run trend for the United States has been increasing. If you look at the long run, yeah, there's some dips, but overall it's been rising over time. And this is what we want. We don't want to stagnate as an economy. And so the higher GDP that we can get, then the higher real GDP per capita that we will have. And this can also measure not only our living standards, but also the average productivity per person in the United States, because income is production. If you recall the chapter on GDP where we said we can measure a country's income, either through production, C, I, G, and NX, or through their income. So what we produce is what we earn back as income. And so we can see here, this is 1900 on the very far end of the scale. And we can see over time that, yes, we've had some dips like here for the Great Depression. And then this is our productivity skyrocketed during World War II. And overall, the overall trend has been upward. Over here is the Great Recession, but then we started growing again. And so we can see that the average American can now buy more than 8 times as many goods and services than they could in 1900. And we can see of course, this is 2009 dollars, but over there, real GDP per capita was about 55,000 per person. So what we do see is that often economic prosperity and health outcomes go hand in hand. So you can see this is the life expectancy at birth on the vertical axis, horizontal axis, the different countries, and then we have the blue bars is the life expectancy in 1900, and then the purple bar is the life expectancy in 2017. And so if you go back to the last slide, and you can see how real GDP per capita has risen over the years, what we see is our life expectancy has also risen. And so you can see in 1900, the average life expectancy in the United States was just under 50 years. And it was actually a little bit less than United Kingdom in 1900 and about on par with France. And you could see India's life expectancy in 1900 was about 30 years, which is very quite low. And that just gives you an idea of their living standards during that time period, how poor people were and how there was no access, very little access to proper health care. And now in 2017, you can see in the United States, it's about 80 years. Same with the United Kingdom. France is a little bit higher, probably about 82, 83 years. And even India has increased during that time to 70 years. And another measure of economic prosperity that you may not think of, but it's our leisure time. So because we are able to produce more goods and services in a shorter period of time, our productivity has risen. So our leisure time has also risen. So you can see on the vertical axis here, we have lifetime hours. On the horizontal axis, we have the different time periods, 1880, 1995, and then what's expected to be in 2040. And so the blue bar is lifetime discretionary hours. These are the amount of hours we have after sleep that we can either use for work or leisure. And so you can see in 1880, leisure time was quite low and working hours was very high. Okay. And then in 1995, you can see we had a lot more leisure time. In fact, leisure time was higher than work hours. And then this trend is expected to continue, and where we will have even more leisure time and less hours of paid work. So to calculate growth rates from year to year, again, we use the percentage change formula, new minus old divided by old times 100. So the newer years is 2016 minus 2015 divided by 2015 real GDP times 100, and we get that real GDP from 2015 to 2016 grew by 1.6%. And so if we want to find out the growth rate over a period of a few years, then what we can do is just add those years together. In this case, we want to know the average growth rate from 2014 to 2016, and we can do 2.4% in 2014. We just add each year, so 2.4 plus 2.6 plus 1.6 divided by the number of years. In this case, we're looking at 3 years times 100, and we get the average growth rate between 2014 and 2016 for real GDP was 2.2%. And so for longer time periods, you could use a shortcut called the rule of 70. And so, and this will give you a good rule of thumb about how long it would take for something to double. So in this case, if the growth rate is 5%, and we want to know how long will it take for real GDP to double at a growth rate of 5%, then you would divide 70 by 5. Notice here, you keep it at 5. You don't convert it to a decimal. So it'll be 70 divided by 5. And this is also useful if you want to know, even if you put your money, let's say, in a savings account, and you want to know how long will it take for your money to double. And so you would just divide 70 by the interest rate. So your interest rate is 2%, then it would take 35 years, 70 divided by 2, for the money in your account to double. Okay, so what determines the rate of long-run growth is productivity. GDP is a market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a given period of time. So when we look at that definition, we're looking at the production of a country. And so the more productive we can be, then the higher GDP will be as well. And so, why does the average American consume 8 times as many goods and services today than they did in 1900? It's because the average American produces 8 times as many goods and services per hour than they did in 1900. So labor productivity has increased. And what's labor productivity? And this is the quantity of goods and services that can be produced by one worker or by 1 hour of work. So this is the key to GDP growing in the long run. So what affects labor productivity? One of it is capital. So what's capital? Remember, in this course, it's not, stocks, bonds, cash. It's goods that are used to produce other goods and services. So the better or the more capital a worker has available to use, the more computers they have, the more equipment they have, the more land, etc., then the more productive they will be. And this also includes human capital. And this is the accumulated knowledge and skills workers possess. So the better training they have, the more knowledge they have about the processes, then the more productive they will be. And also technological change, and this is improvements in capitals or methods to combine inputs into outputs. So think about how much more efficient our computers have become over time. Think about our phones. I mean, we can work a lot of times just from our phones alone. Even things such as the introduction of air conditioning has led to increases in productivity. I mean, it was very hard for people to work during heat waves, and now they can work because they're inside a air-conditioned building. And another factor is entrepreneurs. They are the ones who bring new ways to produce something, and usually to be more efficient at production and to be able to produce a good or service at a lower cost. And if they can produce a good or service at a lower cost, then it becomes more available to the average worker. And there has been the cost of certain things that have decreased over time. The cost of communication, before it was very expensive, for example, to conduct long distance calls, and now we can do it almost for free, especially when we talk about Zoom or Skype or WhatsApp, etc. And due to these entrepreneurs, the introduction of the internet, for example, we're able to work at home. Um, the economy today would be in much worse shape during this pandemic if we didn't have the ability to transition work and school activities to home. If we had to be in an office, and a lot of us wouldn't have been able to continue working, and productivity would have taken a nosedive. Another important key point is we need property rights. If a government, if you can start it, let's say you start a business and the government can come in and take away your land and your business, and there's no repercussions to them, then you probably wouldn't invest all that time and money and risk in opening a business because there's not secure property rights. So it's something, again, in the United States, we take for granted. Government doesn't usually come and seize our land. But in other countries, this is a real problem. And without property rights, then um, a lot of businesses are scared to start. A lot of entrepreneurs are scared to um, bring their ideas to fruition because all their hard work can be wiped out and taken from them overnight. So property rights are key in order to have a growing and thriving economy. Okay. India had a rapid economic rise the last several decades. And before its independence from England in the late 40s, growth rates in India were very low, and India was desperately poor. If you recall a few slides back, their life expectancy was around 30 years old in 1900. And so it kind of hovered around the same during that time period. And in 1991, the Indian government decided to scale back central planning meaning um, scale back government regulations and institute more free market based reforms. And so this resulted into higher growth rates and better improved health and educational outcomes. And India, it still has ways to go, and they still have to make their court systems more robust, commit to a rule of law, and keep upgrading their infrastructure. And it's things that, again, it could be have better roads. So that way trade can occur between different parts of India. That people need to be able to access different areas in order to be able to like trade goods and services, for example, conduct business. All right, potential GDP is the level of real GDP that occurs when all firms are operating at capacity. Capacity means normal hours and a normal size workforce. So Potential GDP rises when a few factors change. So, for example, if we have an increase in the labor force, potential GDP will rise. When a nation can acquire more capital, then they have more capital to produce more goods and services. And also when new technologies are created. So think about the rise in potential GDP with the introduction of the internet, for example. So the growth in potential GDP here in the United States has been steady at about 3.2%. This is the yearly average in during the Great Recession of 2007, 2009. That growth dropped, but after that, it had picked back up again. All right, so actual GDP is the blue line, and the purple line is potential real GDP, or red line. Kind of looks like a red purple. And we see here on the vertical axis is real GDP in 2009 dollars, and then on the horizontal axis are the different years. So we have like 1989 here, all the way to 2017. And so what we see is that during recessions, actual real GDP is lower than potential GDP. Why? Because um, not everyone, unemployment is higher. And so not all capital is being used, not all workers are being used. So it's the actual production is less than potential GDP. And potential GDP again assumes that all workers, for example, are being used and all capital is being used, etc. And we see again where actual GDP during the recession of 2001 was below, and then you can see there was quite a large gap during the Great Recession when we had very high unemployment, hovering at 10% for quite a long period of time. So moving forward, we're going to talk about saving investment in the financial system and how this facilitates long-run economic growth. So firms can finance their own expansions, whether they need to acquire more land to build more operations or acquire more um, capital stock, or even just to be able to train their workforce better. And so they can finance some of this through retained earnings. So, when they make a profit, they can reinvest that profit back into their firm. But sometimes expansion requires more than their profits, so they don't have all of it. And so they can obtain these funds through the financial system. They can go borrow. And so the financial system is the system of financial markets and financial intermediaries, such as banks, through which firms acquire funds from households. So, households put their money in banks, and banks will loan out these funds to other households or to businesses. So financial markets are markets where financial securities, and as financial security is like a stock or a bond, are bought and sold. So a financial security, again, is a document stating the terms under which funds pass from the buyer of the security to the seller. So a stock is a financial security representing partial ownership of a firm. So if you own Coca-Cola stock, if you own Apple stock, if you own Tesla stock, then you actually are a partial owner of those companies. And so, you buy these stocks, and you do so because you're hoping, right, that the stock price will rise and you will make money, or you will also earn, if they pay dividends, earn some money through their dividends as well. And then a bond is a financial security promising to repay a fixed amount of funds. So if you buy a $100 bond, and the interest rate on that bond is 2%, then, eventually when that bond matures, and you'll get your $100 plus the interest rate promised back to you. And so it's usually bonds are a bit safer than stocks, but stocks usually have a higher potential rate of return. So, the trade-off for taking on the risk of a stock is a potential higher rate of return. And financial intermediaries are firms such as banks, mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and they borrow funds from savers and they lend them to borrowers. So 3 key services of the financial system is one, it allows investors to, it says risk sharing Um, in other words, investors can spread their money over different assets. So usually what you see is they'll have a portfolio of some stocks, but also some bonds, some safer investments, and then some riskier investments. And you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So if you only owned Apple stock, and if Apple tanked for whatever reason and went under, then you could lose all your money overnight. So it's good to spread out your risk. The financial system also allows liquidity, so savers can convert their investments into cash. Usually for like a stock or a bond, etc. I mean, it takes a couple of days for that transaction to go through, but 2, 3 days, and then they can have their cash back. And it also provides information. So the prices of stocks and bonds represents the beliefs of other investors and financial intermediaries about the future revenue stream. So if Tesla stock keeps rising, then that means investors believe, they're buying more and more of this stock because they believe that Tesla is producing good products and that they will continue to make a profit in the future and that they will continue to grow, for example. And whenever investors lose faith in a certain firm, then they tend to sell their stock and they believe it's not going to be as profitable and they want to cut their losses short. So in an economy, a closed economy, savings equals investment. And so we can derive this looking over here. So we know that GDP equals consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So let's assume for now this is a closed economy. So there is no exports and imports. And we will look at the case of an open economy in a future chapter. And so in a closed economy, GDP is consumption, investment, and government purchases. So if we rearrange this expression to solve for investment, we see that investment equals GDP. So, income, because remember, GDP is either production or income. It's the same. What we sell is what we earn back in income. So it's income minus what households spend minus what the government spends. So when we talk about savings, we're talking about private savings, and this is savings by households, and public savings. This is savings by the government. And so private savings is the income households earn plus any transfer payments. Remember, transfer payments can be like welfare, for example, and minus what households spend and minus what they pay in taxes. And so government savings, this is public savings, is what the government earns in tax revenue minus what they spend, minus what they pay out to households in transfer payments. And so this number can be negative, and this would be known as dissaving or a budget deficit if it's negative, and a budget surplus if it's positive. So total saving is public and private savings. So we see here that, if we add these two equations together, then we see that the T's cancel out because, households pay taxes to the government. So, subtracted from households, added government, so it cancels out. And then transfer payments also cancel out. And so we're left with total saving is income, so GDP income minus what households spend minus what the government spends. And so in a closed economy, savings equals investment. And so when public savings, meaning government savings, is zero, then we say that the government has a balanced budget. And if the government is spending more than what they're earning in tax revenue, then we say they have a budget deficit. So if public saving is negative, it's a budget deficit. And if public saving is positive, then we say it's a budget surplus. And so how does the government fund a budget deficit? So it funds it by selling bonds. And it sells it here in the United States to households, but also to foreigners abroad. And it's a key point to note that when they're selling these bonds, this takes away from the money available for investment spending. The financial system is composed of different markets, so markets for stocks, the markets for bonds, the markets for CDs at banks, markets for mutual funds, etc. So a way that we can model this is to combine them in a single market called the market for loanable funds. And so this is a conceptual interaction of borrowers and lenders, and this will determine the market interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds exchange. And so again, for now, we will assume that the only interactions are between domestic households and firms. Since we are assuming a closed economy, there is no interaction with foreign lenders and borrowers. And so on the vertical axis, we have the real interest rate. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of loanable funds. And the supply of loanable funds comes from savings. So I remember this by, supply. Um, I always mark supply and demand S and D. And so supply, and so starts with an S, and savings starts with an S. So this is public and private savings. So anytime there's an increase in savings, supply will shift to the right. Anytime there's a decrease in savings, supply will shift to the left, for example. And then the demand for loanable funds comes from borrowers. Firms that want to borrow money for investment purposes, or households that want to borrow money to buy a house, for example. So anytime, there's an increase in demand will shift to the right for loanable funds, and whenever there's a decrease for demand for loanable funds, then demand will shift to the left. All right, so let's look at an example that would increase demand for loanable funds. So let's say that there's this new technology introduced, and so investments become more profitable for firms. And since investments are more profitable, they increase their demand for loanable funds in order to be able to buy and implement this new technology. So they need more money in order to be able to afford it. So demand shifts to the right. This puts upward pressure on the real interest rate. And so remember, real interest rate is the price of money. Okay. It's, either the price you get paid when you save your money or the price you pay to borrow money. So real interest rate increases. And since real interest rate is higher, we see this also increases the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Okay, so there's been an increase in the demand for loanable funds and an increase in the quantity of loanable funds supplied. So let's say that the government had a balanced budget and now it is running a deficit. So since they are spending more than what they're earning in tax revenue, this decreases savings. So the shift supply of loanable funds to the left. But what we do see here is, since now there's less loanable funds available, the price of loanable funds increases. What's the price of loanable funds? It's the real interest rate. So there's upward pressure in the real interest rate, and now we have a decrease in the quantity of loanable funds demanded because borrowing money is now more expensive than before. And since firms are not borrowing as much money, or households are not borrowing money for, let's say mortgages, for example, and investment decreases. So this is called the crowding out effect. And this is when a government deficit shifts supply of loanable funds to the left, increases interest rate, higher interest rates decrease investment. So that's the crowding out effect, is the decline in private expenditures, a decline in investment because of a budget deficit, a government saving. So in a closed economy, the effect of a budget deficit on equilibrium interest rates would be much larger, but in reality, we are an open economy and interest rates are influenced by many other factors, including global markets. So a budget deficit in reality doesn't have as much of a pronounced effect on the interest rate as we saw in the example. So here's just a good summary in a chart. So an increase in a budget deficit would shift supply of loanable funds to the left. Real interest rate would rise and investment would decrease. So that's again the crowding out effect. I'm just going to make a note here. This is a crowding out effect. Uh, an increase in the desire of households to consume more today. That means they're not saving as much. They're spending more of their money than they're saving. So supply of loanable funds shifts to the left. Real interest rate rises and investment decreases. And then an increase in tax benefits for savings, such as retirement accounts, which, if you have to pay less taxes on your retirement accounts, and this encourages savings and putting more money into these accounts. And so supply of loanable funds would shift to the right, real interest rate would decrease, and investment would increase. An increase in expected future profits would shift demand of loanable funds to the right. So if they see the economy is strong or an industry is increasing demand, has increasing demand, and they believe that there's more profits to be had, so firms would demand more loanable funds in order to grow these industries, and this would cause the real interest rate and the level of investment to increase. And then an increase in corporate taxes shifts demand of loanable funds to the left, real interest rate and the level of investment decreases. Okay, moving forward to the business cycle. So we see that in the long run, real GDP has increased over time, but we also saw, there was, some blips and some rises in that line. And, this is the business cycle. That's what it illustrates. It illustrates periods of economic expansion and economic recession, and this is normal. Every country experiences these fluctuations in growth. So we see the business cycle modeled over here. So we have a period of what we call economic expansion. So you see vertical axis is real GDP. This is time. So when real GDP is rising, we are in an economic expansion, and eventually it hits a peak. And then when GDP starts to fall, we are in recession. And so recession is defined by economists as GDP declining for 2 quarters in a row, so 6 months in a row. And eventually it hits the bottom, and then it starts growing again, economic expansion, and usually real GDP in the second expansion will be higher than it was in the first. And so we see the long-term trend of real GDP being positive. All right, so these are the different years starting from a little bit before 2007. So, we had a downturn in 2001, and then we started growing again. And then it eventually reached a peak in late 2007. And then we had the Great Recession, and real GDP declined significantly. I mean, they don't call it the Great Recession for nothing. It was the largest downturn since the Great Depression. And then we entered in a long period of economic expansion. And of course, that stopped here, in 2020 due to the pandemic, but now GDP is growing again. So the federal government doesn't define a recession. It's usually a consensus among economists, and the general consensus is if GDP declines for 2 consecutive, meaning back-to-back quarters in a row. So each quarter is 3 months. So if GDP declines for 6 months in a row, then they say we are in a recession. And so we see, we've had different business cycles throughout the history. We could see in July 1953, we hit the peak, and then there was a recession that lasted 10 months. And then in the late 50s again for 8 months, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They had a longer period in the early 80s of 16 months, and then the Great Recession of 18 months. So the National Bureau of Economic Research says a recession is a significant decline in activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months, visible in industrial production, employment, real income, and wholesale retail trade. So a lot of economists will defer to this definition, and a few months, again, 2 consecutive quarters in a row or more. Because sometimes, let's say, GDP may decline for one quarter very briefly and then increase again. So they don't really consider that a recession. It has to be for a significant period of time. So usually during the business cycle, near the end of an expansion, we see rising interest rates, not always, but often rising interest rates, and the wages of workers are rising faster than other prices. So, economic activity reaches this maturation point, but wages keep on rising. However, firm profits start falling because they're not selling any more goods or services at that point, but wages are one of their largest costs. And then a recession begins. So firms decrease their investment spending, they decrease their production, sometimes if they have a surplus of goods and services. Then they lay off workers. Households consume less either because they've been laid off or because they're uncertain about the future. And so the cycle kind of accumulates over here. And then conditions will improve. Sometimes there's a stimulus that's undertaken, like the Fed will lower interest rates to encourage investment spending, or the government will focus on fiscal expansion policies and to give the economy a boost again, and economic conditions will improve. So firms will start hiring again, and producing more. And the more people they hire, then the more households that are earning income. The more households that are earning income, the more they are spending on goods and services that go back as income to firms and households, etc. So usually when a recession hits, workers do reduce their spending. And I think 2020 is a year to look at that too. So many households delayed purchases because with the pandemic, things were very uncertain. And so, when they're delaying purchases, um, businesses aren't earning as much money. And so they either go under or they cut back on their employment of workers. But what we do see is when households reduce their spending, it doesn't affect all goods equally. So, households will continue to buy non-durable goods like food, some clothing, but purchases of durable goods. So they may delay buying a new car or a new appliance, for example, or new furniture. Those are the ones that take a larger hit. During the Great Recession, the demand for motor vehicles dramatically dropped. And we can see here the green line is demand for motor vehicles, or the sales of motor vehicles. And so we see here that there was a sharp drop during the Great Recession. And it could be too, households just hold on to their vehicles longer, or it could be since some workers are out of work and they're no longer commuting, they didn't need to buy a new vehicle, etc. So there's various reasons. But what we see is that Chevron's sale of gasolines dropped during this time period too, but not as much because gasoline is a non-durable. There were still people buying gasoline. There's still people with cars. They still need gas, or they're holding on to their existing car longer. That's fine, but they still need gas to drive that existing car, etc. The business cycle does have an effect on inflation. So during economic expansions, when households are demanding more goods and services, when firms are demanding more goods and services, equipment, etc., and the increasing demand for these products raises the price for these products, and this increases overall inflation. If you think about the CPI, or the producer price index, etc., all of this rises. And then during recessions, when demand for products and services is low, what we see is that we usually still have inflation. It's rare we go into deflation, but it's a lower rate of inflation. So we see here that this is the inflation rate on the vertical axis. This is the percentage change in the CPI. And, this is positive inflation rate, negative inflation rate, and then the pink bars are economic recessions. And so during recessions, we do see inflation rates decrease. So in this case, prices are still rising, right? They're just not rising at, let's say, 6.5%. They dropped to 3% per year. And so this is a period of disinflation. So disinflation is not negative inflation, it's a reduction in the inflation rate. And during the Great Recession, there was a time period, very short, where we actually felt in deflation. And this is where the prices of goods and services actually dropped. So remember, disinflation, prices are still rising. It's just a reduction in the rate that they're rising. It's a reduction in the inflation rate. But deflation is when prices actually start to fall. And that's rare. You could see in all these other recessions that we had disinflation, but prices were still rising, just not as high of a rate. And this red line here is the unemployment rate. And so we see during recessions that unemployment tends to rise. And then we see during the Great Recession, a dramatic increase in the unemployment rate, got to be a little bit above 10%. And then over time, very slowly though, I mean, this took a lot of years to get it back to the natural rate, which is between 4 and 5%. It took a very long period of years to get it back to that point. So this graph represents fluctuations in real GDP, and what we see is that before 1950, fluctuations in real GDP were a lot greater. You could see here it's a lot more dramatic dips and peaks. And then after 1950, they have been smaller. Like the range for these fluctuations has been much more narrow. And so business cycles in general, minus the Great Recession, have been mild during the mid-1980s. And so some economists call this period the Great Moderation, where yes, we do have economic fluctuations, but they're not as dramatic. And what we also see is that the average length of recessions has dropped over time, and the average length of expansions has increased over time. So like for 1870 to 1900, the average length of a economic expansion was 26 months. And then in 1950 to 2009, it was 61 months. And even this last expansion, even though it was slow, it lasted 10 years almost. So cue in the Great Recession. And so some economists, Great Recession had a very profound effect and it lasted a very long time. So some economists are wondering if the period of Great Moderation is over or not. So, but overall, why have fluctuations outside of the Great Recession been more mild? And this is because we have also shifted to a service-oriented economy versus a manufacturing economy, because usually manufacturing takes more of a direct hit during economic recessions. Also, we have better benefits. So before the 1930s, in fact, due to the Great Recession, the Great Depression, the severity of it, these programs came about because of it. Unemployment insurance. So if you get laid off, you get some government benefits to keep you afloat until you find your next job, or at least for a period of time. And then, government transfer programs like Social Security, the elderly now have Social Security benefits that come into them, or if someone's spouse dies, then their widower can get Social Security payments to help keep them afloat, especially if that spouse were like the only one working, then the widowed spouse would have zero income. And so, they qualify for Social Security. And so these programs give income to people. So during recessions, if they lose their job or something happens, they still have some income coming in, and they're using that income to buy goods and services. There's also a lot of what we call active federal government stabilization policies, and this is the government fiscal policy. So usually what they government does is during an economic recession, they have expansionary fiscal policy. They may lower taxes and or increase government spending to help give the economy a boost. And we'll discuss this in further detail in a chapter coming up soon. And then there's also increased stability of the financial system. The financial system is more robust, more challenges. We have the Federal Reserve that has like more powers now to help stabilize the financial system as well. All right, and this concludes chapter 10.